your first time or you haven't been around the 10:30 for a while, it's great to have you joining us. And as a church, I think it's about 8 weeks now at the 10:30, we have been journeying through the book of Romans. And Romans is this letter we find in the New Testament. It was written by the Apostle Paul in about AD 57. And he was writing it to the Christians who lived in Rome at the time, with lots of encouragements for them. And there's lots for us as well today. And so we've been traveling through this book, and a few times we said, as we've spoken about it, that Romans is a little bit like a range of mountains. And so there's some peaks and there's some valleys. And a couple of weeks ago, I spoke on Romans 8, and we thought about how we can be the most secure people in the world, whatever is going on in our own lives, in the world around us, because of God and all we gain through knowing him, we can be secure. And then the amazing David Bracewell tackled Romans 9 to 11 for us last week. When I was writing the sermon notes before Christmas, I got to Romans 9 to 11. I read round it for a while. I then had a little panic. I rang David and was like, David, can you help me? And 5 minutes into the conversation, I said, actually, would you just preach on it for me? So he kindly did that last week. And then we're back up again on a high top today in Romans 12. But actually, I think it's good whenever someone is preaching, you want to be asking yourselves, God, what are you saying to me today? What is the changes that you want me to be making in my life? Because as we delve into the Bible, it needs to be changing the way we choose to live out our lives. So if we think right back to the beginning of Romans, for those of you who have been here throughout the journey, back in Romans, chapter 1, verse 7, it says, to all in Rome, not this one yet, we'll come to that in a moment. Sorry, it's one that's not on there. To all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be his holy people. To all in Rome who are loved by God. And these first 11 chapters in Romans, they've kept on showing us time and time again how loved we are by God, how incredible his love is for us. But it goes on to say who are called to be his holy people. This idea that we are loved by God, but we're then called to live lives set apart for him. That this love of his is meant to make a difference in the way that we live our lives. We're called to live these lives which are devoted to God. Our lives should look different from people who don't follow him. And that's not something we need to be apologetic for. That's a good thing. So we're going to be thinking this morning about what does a life devoted to God look like? What does a life devoted to God look like? And how can I become more devoted? So shall we pray together as I start? Father, I want to thank you for your love. I want to thank you for the sacrifices you have made for us. And Lord, I pray this morning as we jump in and we look at your word, will you help us to learn what it means to be devoted to you? And will you help us to grow in that in our day-to-day lives? In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. A couple of weeks ago when I spoke, I kind of tried to cover the whole of Romans 8 in one 25-minute preach. So today when we look at Romans 12, I'm going to go the other way, and we're just going to look at the first 2 verses. That's what we're going to focus in on. But the rest of Romans 12 as well, there's so much treasure in there. So go away and read it. Really encourage you to jump into it for yourselves. But Romans 12, these are the verses now. Say this. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. That first little bit says, therefore I urge you. Or in older translations, I quite like the words, I beseech you, not the kind of language we use nowadays. But you get this sense from Paul that this is really important to him. He's saying, I urge you, come on, live your life in a different way. He's saying to us that we've got this choice about how we choose to live our lives. But he goes on to say, I urge you, because of God's mercy. So we choose to live our lives in a certain way because of the mercies of God. And Romans 1 to 11, it has shown us so many different mercies that God offers us. We've spoken about how we've been set free from both the guilt and the power of sin. We've looked at how we are God's children, we're co-heirs with Jesus. We've talked about how God never abandons us, that there's nothing that can separate us from his love. We've talked about how God works for the good of us, that even when we make mistakes, he brings all things and turns them around for the good of us. We've thought about how we can be secure in our future, in what is to come. And the list of God's mercies go on and on and on. I could spend the whole time just listing those. And as I pondered on them this week, I thought, why doesn't everyone choose to follow Jesus? It is incredible, these mercies of God. And so often we talk about being a Christian, we home in on God's love and what he has to offer us. But when we're told by someone that they love us, I think their response, if you say to someone, I love you, you're not hoping they're going to say back to you, oh, that's kind, or, well, thank you so much for mentioning that, or I might go away and ponder on that, or think about that. If I said to my husband, I love you, I'm hoping he's going to say back, I love you too. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for a bit of someone's heart. And in the same way, as we see all these mercies of God, we want to say thank you to God. We want to be grateful. But actually, there needs to be a response from our heart as well. These mercies need to impact the way we then choose to live our life. Romans is this book full of theology, in places quite deep theology, which we tried to get our heads around. It tells us about the nature of God. But this nature of God, this theology, then needs to impact how we live. These truths need to be lived out in our lives. So these next few chapters of Romans, it gets much more practical. And so we're going to be looking at how do we devote our lives to God. So being devoted to God, firstly, means living a life of sacrifice. It means living a life of sacrifice. It doesn't mean that our aim in life is to live a life of luxury or a life with no challenge, a life which is easy. It's not about trying to live a life where we look successful in the world way or become popular. It's about a life of sacrifice. And when we sacrifice something, it means giving something up which is valued for something which is more worthy or more important or more valuable. For us as Christians, it means giving something up for God, who actually we say is worthy or more valuable than the thing we are giving up. As we've traveled through this book of Romans, we've mentioned a few times that the original people this letter was written to, in that day, sacrifice was a part of their everyday culture. So when Paul talks about sacrifice, they kind of straight away know something of what he's talking about. There were sacrifices made in the temple. And also as we look back to the Old Testament, before Jesus was here on earth, a big part of what they did in their relationship with God was make sacrifices. And there's three types of kind of main types of sacrifice. There's sin and guilt offerings, there's burnt offerings, and there's fellowship offerings. That's what we discover in the Old Testament. And the idea of a guilt sin offering was that a priest would make an offering on behalf of the people. So when we'd done things wrong, the priest would make this offering as a way of us being able to receive forgiveness from God. For us today, we don't need to do that because Jesus came and he died once and for all. He was the ultimate sacrifice for us. But then burnt offerings were this voluntary act of worship. When someone would want to give a gift to God, and it's their way of saying to God, I'm devoted to you. It's an act of worship, of saying, I want to surrender to you. I love you. I want to give this to you. And the way they would do it is they'd place it on the altar part by part. And this kind of showed to God, I want to give you every part of me. And then that offering was burnt as there was nothing given back to the person who'd offered it. And then fellowship offerings are similar, but at the end, it would be given back. The grain or the lamb would be given back to that worshipper to enjoy. So some sacrifices meant giving kind of everything up to God and you'd get nothing back. Whereas others, you'd offer it up and then something would be returned to you. For us today, we don't bring offerings in those ways. We no longer bring a sacrifice, but we're called to be a sacrifice for God. That is what this verse is about. We're called to be a living sacrifice for Jesus. Galatians 2 verse 20 helps us to understand this a bit more. It says this, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. There's this sense that as we follow Jesus, we give our life over to him. When Jesus was here on earth, we quite often see in the Gospels that when he called people to follow him, he doesn't say, come and follow me and it's an easy life. But he would often say, I'm asking you to give up everything. That's a big call, isn't it? Will you give up everything to follow me? This idea of total surrender to God is the highest form of worship. That is the worship that God is looking for. Worshipping when we come and we sing songs, that's a really key part of our walk with God. And I personally find that way that really helps me grow in my relationship with him. And we're so grateful to our worship leaders. We're not saying we don't need you. That is an important part of what we do. But actually living a life of worship, that is just a small part of it. It's living out our faith day by day. We're called to give our whole lives, as I've said, to God, to surrender. And sometimes that might find it easy, and sometimes that might be harder. When God first started calling to me about becoming a church leader, about being ordained, we can say that I wasn't very impressed. I didn't think it was one of his better ideas. And for many years, people have been saying to me, do you think you should be ordained? Do you think God's calling you to it? And I used to be like, no. And I even had one friend was like, we're not discussing it anymore. And then we were at Focus one year that Sarah was just talking about, where we go away all together as churches. And there's this big top where there's probably about 5,000-6,000 of us in there worshipping. And I'd been singing that worship song, I Surrender All to You. And I was singing from the bottom of my heart, really meaning it in a great place. And then much to my dismay, at the end of that set of worship, they did a call forward for people who God was calling to be ordained. And I don't know if you've ever had it where your heart starts to beat and you're like, oh no. I've been saying for years, this isn't for me. And right now, I can't deny it anymore. I know it's what he's saying to me. And so they called people forward. And I'd love to say I went forward and got prayer. I went out the back of the tent. And I went in a really holy response. And I went and sat on the beach and cried. And said to God, I don't want to do this. This might be your idea. This is not what I want for my life. And so I messaged a good friend at the time because I thought, I know what's going to happen. By tomorrow morning, I'll have talked myself out of it and said he never was speaking to me. So I messaged a friend for accountability. And then I went home back to where I lived, and I cried for 2 more days. And during that time, I had this discussion with God. But I knew that I couldn't say, I surrender all, and then ignore what he was saying to me. And now everything's changed, but for those 2 days, it felt really painful. And for me, my struggle was, I felt at that moment, it wasn't the truth, but it felt very real there, that actually in becoming a vicar, I was going to sacrifice so much. I had a lot of non-Christian friends, and I thought it's going to become awkward between them. They, in fact, had been waiting for me to say it, apparently, for years. I didn't know what my family would think. I loved the job I was in. And actually, for me at the time, I think the biggest thing was I was single. I was longed to be married. I was in my early 40s. And I thought, who's going to want to marry a vicar, a female vicar? And so in that moment, my thing of surrender was saying to God, okay, all these dreams, all these things I've longed for, actually, I am going to give them up for you, if this is what you're calling me to do. And then I started on the journey, and so quickly God changed my heart. And you'll be pleased to know I love my job. It all changed very quickly, and I can't imagine, Phil's nodding, I can't imagine doing anything else. I feel so me. I feel this is what I'm called to do. I get to come to an amazing church like Werbs and do life with you guys. God knows us so much better than we know ourselves. And after I became a vicar, I met my now husband. For me, that was a fellowship offering. I felt I was giving up so much, and God has given me back way more than I sacrificed for him. I think there's moments in life where there's those kind of bigger moments where hopefully you won't cry for 2 days, but it feels that kind of moment. But actually, so much more of living a life of sacrifice is about the small things. It's about the day in, day out, those much smaller decisions we make. The Message version of these verses, I think, puts it so well. It says it like this. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. It doesn't often have to be these huge things. It can be these small, everyday little things. And Romans 12 does go on to give a few more examples. It talks in verse 10, it says, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Sometimes that can feel like a sacrifice. Verse 13, share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. It might be that you're called to be part of the tea and toast team and to practice hospitality at 2 a.m. in the morning. For some of you, you're often up at that time. For me, that lack of sleep would be a massive sacrifice. But perhaps that's what God is calling you to do. It goes on, bless those who persecute you. Again, that can be really hard. That's not the way of the world. That's not the way we'd often naturally behave. Or rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Perhaps you're called to give up some time this week and walk with someone who's grieving. Often when we live a life of sacrifice, at times it can feel costly. But it's about the choices we make day in, day out, honouring God. It's about not always going for the easiest option, not always taking the path of the biggest comfort, but saying to God, what do you want me to do with this decision? And as I said, it's about offering each part of ourselves to God. And I think we're all different, and there'll be some things that some of us find easier to sacrifice than others, and other things that perhaps you find really hard to sacrifice where someone else can. So it's not about saying to God, you can have my relationships and my time, but not my finances, because I earn that and it's mine. It's about it all. Or perhaps you find it really easy to give your finances, but you say, actually, in relationships, it's up to me who I date. Or you might say, you can have my Sundays to Thursdays, possibly even my Fridays, but Saturdays are mine to do life how I want. Or I'll follow you apart from on the football pitch, or when I'm out with my work colleagues. God longs for all of us, for all of our heart. And so I wonder if there's something, as I'm speaking, in your life, if perhaps there's one area where you think, in that area, I find it much harder to surrender to God. Or perhaps an area which you've surrendered before and you need to come back and surrender again. Because I think another thing when we hear this word living sacrifice is that it's this idea that it's a continuous process. It's not like that we make a sacrifice once and then it's done. I can tick that box, done that. But it's something that we need to continue to do. Andrew Ollerton, who wrote a commentary on Romans that I was reading, he says this: after all, the problem with living sacrifices is that they tend to wriggle off the altar. And I like that, because I thought, that's quite me. I make the sacrifice, and I'm all there, perhaps in the middle of a worship song, gets to Tuesday, and I'm like, oh, it's quite tempting just to wriggle back off that altar. And that's that idea of it being continuous, was keeping on, coming back, keeping on, bringing our lives to God. keeping on saying, actually, God, will you look at my heart again? And so as we learn to live this life of sacrifice, I think there's some things we can do to help us. Something people often do during Lent and this time up to Easter is they abstain from something. And so we choose to give something up because we do it. So perhaps we give up chocolate or social media. But it's our way of saying to God, actually, God, you mean more to me than these things. And so it might be there's something in your life that you know perhaps is a little too important. And you might want to say, actually, I'm going to give that up for a few weeks because I want to say to God again that you are the most important one in my life. You know, any small sacrifice we make for God, it's nothing compared to the sacrifice he's made for us. So that's just verse 1. Don't worry, we're going to do verse 2 a little bit quicker. So Paul goes on in verse 2 to say this: do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Or the way the Message puts it again, I think is really helpful. It says, don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Paul goes on from calling us to be a living sacrifice to saying that actually if we're going to be this sacrifice, it's not about conforming to the world, but it's about being transformed. Because as we're transformed, become more like Jesus, it will mean living a life more full of sacrifice, because that's what Jesus did. He left the wonders of heavens and came in the most humble way, knowing that he was going to die for us on the cross. He made that incredible sacrifice. And throughout his time here on earth, he kept on living this life of sacrifice. And so if we're going to be transformed to be more like Jesus, that will mean growing in this area. Do you know, as we're transformed to become more like Jesus, I think I used to think years ago that when we talked about transformation or being changed, that would mean that my life would become smaller, I'd become more boring, become more mundane. And yet it's the absolute opposite. As we're transformed to become more like Jesus, we become more of the people that we're created to be. We become more fully alive. As we make sacrifices, we actually get to live life in its fullest. It sounds counter, what do you say? It sounds like that shouldn't be the way, but it is, because that is how God does it. And as the verse tells us, Paul is really helpful. So if you're thinking, well, how am I transformed? Paul tells us in this verse, it's by the renewing of our mind, that's the place that it starts. And so Romans 1 to 11 have told us all these truths. They've given us these truths to have in our mind. And it gives us these different lenses to see ourselves, to see the world in. As they just put it in the Message, we're called to fix our attention on God. And so if we're going to fix our attention on God, that means more than just kind of giving God our attention on a Sunday morning. Because actually we spend so much of our time away from church. This is just a small part of our walk with God. Because we're then out in the world all the week. That's where we're immersed. And there's so much good about the world. But we want God to be the one directing the way we live. J.B. Phillips says, don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold. And that can be so easy to happen. If we don't keep on fixing our attention on God, then suddenly we realize we're being squeezed into a different mold. And so one of the key ways our mind is renewed is through reading the Bible. That's the way that we can learn more of God and be changed. As if you don't have a Bible and you'd like one, we've got lots of free Bibles. So come and chat to me afterwards. We can give you a Bible so that you've got one to read. Or perhaps you started the year. January feels a long time ago now, doesn't it? But perhaps you started this year and thought, right, this is the year. I'm going to go for it. I'm going to read the Bible this year. and you got towards the end of January and it's all drifted off. Don't worry. You don't need to wait until next January. You can start again today. These things you can always jump straight back into. But I think something happens that even if we just read a few verses a day, that is then what starts to fill our mind. And we're reminded of this different way that we can live. Don't be squeezed into the world, but with God's help, be transformed to become more of who you were created to be. There's no shortcuts, I don't think, to living a life devoted to God. But I know for myself that the more I've given of myself to God, the more, in a way, he gives back. That as we live this life of sacrifice, as we allow him to transform us, actually, not only do we receive so much back, but then together we can grow his kingdom. Together we can see this city changed. It's an amazing privilege getting to walk with God. As I said, all those mercies at the beginning, all this that we gain from walking with him. But he does ask for our heart, and he asks for the whole of our hearts. Can I invite the worship band to come on up? And so we're going to spend a moment responding to all this, to circle right back to the beginning, that we live these life of sacrifice, not to earn God's mercies. God's love, his mercy is there, whatever. But we do it in response to it. So could I ask you if you're willing and able to stand? And we're just going to give the Holy Spirit, God's Spirit, his presence here, time to move. And sometimes it's helpful to put your hands out in front of you. Because as we're talking about surrendering to God, there's something of saying, actually, God, I'm here. And I'm saying, come, speak to me. I'm ready to hear from you. Brian, when he was speaking earlier, he said the words about pushing the boat out deeper. And I feel there's something in that for today. I think there's something of God saying to us, will you push the boat out deeper? Like, is there something you can do to take another step towards me? Is there another part of your life that you could devote to me? And I think for each of us that will look different. So I just want to give us a few moments. I could keep waffling on, but I don't think that's helpful. I want to give you that opportunity to hear from God. And some of you will be used to chatting to God. Perhaps some of you here, you're not. But why not just start talking to him where you are? And give him permission to come and examine your heart again. And ask him if there's areas that he would love you to give back to him.